I realize this is late, but there seems to be some confusion about differential reinforcement. I'm not sure why. This is in the past has seemed to be a relatively straightforward kind of module, and also some confusion about the connection between doing a functional assessment and making plans. And I really think it's important that we understand this. So it's not going to be a long intro, but just talk a little bit about some concepts that I think are important to understand. And as we go, I'm not going to go over all the aspects of differential reinforcement. I think you're just going to have to look to the objectives to understand clearly what you're responsible for. Behavioral interventions should always really begin with a functional behavior assessment. And the first module talked about the levels of that, the simple, the full, the functional analysis. But the purpose of all of these functional assessments is to produce correct hypothesis about why the target person is misbehaving. And behaviorists would say, what's the function of the problem behaviors? Remember, we always believe that the person is correct. They're behaving as they should given the existing contingencies. So the functional behavior assessment allows us to understand it could be the same function across different problem settings, multiple functions across the same problem setting, but to produce a hypothesis about the function of problem behaviors. And we talked about the types of functions behaviorists examine. It could be negatively reinforced, positively reinforced, access to social, escape, and so forth. The competing behavior model, which you really need to understand, is an excellent way to structure an hypothesis. It provides a way of looking at the behavioral principles involved, and importantly, to look at three behaviors in any problem setting that we need to understand. First behavior being what behaviors are expected and whether or not the person has the skills to exhibit those behaviors. The second behavior of interest is always the problem behavior or behaviors, the actual ones. And the third behavior of interest is always going to be some hypothetical alternative that might serve the same function as a problem behavior. What would be acceptable? And I'll talk more about that now. Interventions are planned based on this structure, based on these hypotheses, and it should be. It's an effective. Research clearly supports that functional behavior assessment leads us to understand the necessary interventions to reduce inappropriate behavior. The category of intervention that we're talking about right now, the procedures, just go into the term of differential reinforcement. It says different meanings, but we're talking about it now using differential reinforcement to reduce problem behaviors as part of intervention planning. Differential reinforcement always relate to the matching law, which we'll talk about again, and for which you're responsible. And the idea that we want to make some behaviors more likely and some behaviors less likely, and since they could occur in the same setting, we need to have some idea of why certain behaviors are happening and others are not. There are three general varieties: differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, incompatible behavior, and differential reinforcement of other behavior, and low rates of behavior. These are presented in the chapter. These procedures, which should always flow from a functional assessment, are intended to make problem behaviors inefficient or ineffective. DRO is a little different, and we'll make sure we talk about that. If coupled with extinction or attempted to reduce the amount of reinforcement for problem behaviors, an intervention package that includes differential reinforcement could make problem behavior ineffective, or it could make it inefficient. Differential reinforcement involves reinforcing some other behavior besides the problem behavior while reducing reinforcement for the target behavior. Of course, both problem behaviors and acceptable behaviors could both be exhibited by a child. And if there's natural reinforcement for both of them. And while we're not talking about this now, differential reinforcement doesn't mean teachers or parents or somebody else controlling reinforcement. It could be self-managed, and we're going to spend a whole module on self-management later in the quarter. The matching law describes the relationships between concurrently happening behaviors in a setting, and their own concurrent reinforcement schedules. So you may need to go back and look what that means from the first quarter. So there could be 3 or 4 behaviors that each of which is being reinforced concurrently at some rate. The matching law predicts which of these behaviors is more likely. And you should know that the matching law says that basically the behavior that receives the highest rate of reinforcement or the highest magnitude of reinforcement, latency could play a part, even response effort. That's described in the general matching law, but it allows us to predict, and it's proven, I think, to be pretty accurate about predicting which of several possible behaviors are more likely. The functional behavior assessment, I think, is closely linked to the idea of the matching law, and the matching law is closely linked to the idea of selecting the appropriate intervention based on the hypothesis about the function of the problem behavior. So as part of an intervention package, we're going to reinforce one response class instead of another, or we might punish one response class and reinforce another, or we might remove contingencies from one response class and not from others. So we could reinforce certainly a behavior other than the problem behavior. We could reinforce a reduced rate of problem behaviors, or with some types of differential reinforcement of other behavior, we could delay reinforcement if a problem behavior occurs. Contingent delayed reinforcement is essentially a form of punishment. Almost always when we use differential reinforcement in intervention, we're going to include reduced reinforcement for the problem behavior as part of the package. And again, to remind us that differential reinforcement could be parent managed, teacher managed, self-managed, any kind of thing. In my experience, typically in classrooms, but personnel outside the classroom could manage it. Here's the competing behavior model. Let's just go over it one more time. It involves looking at the critical behavior principles that are going to bear on the problem behaviors and desired behaviors. We have motivating operations that obviously make reinforcers or punishers more or less effective. It's going to be a problem setting, and it could be a specific trigger for the problem behavior. And there are three behaviors, again, in which we're always interested. What behaviors are expected, and whether or not the child's got the skills for those. What the actual problem behaviors are in the setting, and alternative behaviors. And we're also going to be interested in consequences. This is where the concurrent schedules of reinforcement and the idea of there being different reinforcement schedules across these behaviors. So we're interested in the actual consequences for expected behavior. Too often in settings in which we have an interest, in my case, interested in classrooms, if a child does what he's supposed to do, there really are almost no contingencies. He finishes his work, what does he get? Maybe he gets more work. So that's often, I found that often to be true. What's the next set of consequences? What are the actual consequences for a problem behavior? Does a problem behavior function to produce escape from some undesirable task or a situation that's aversive to a person? Or does it function to get access to desired activities or social attention, or what? What's the actual function here? The next set of consequences would be what could be the function for this alternative behavior. The classic example would be, for example, if a behavior problem is escape maintained with a child with a low incidence disability, for example, we might be able to teach them to request a brief break, and then the request is reinforced by giving a break, so it serves the same function, brief escape from some task. This provides a visual structure for the elements of any hypothesis, and literally we could look to the research, and you'll be able to do this hopefully at the end of this quarter, and identify procedures that have involved manipulating motivating operations or problem settings or specific discriminative stimuli, or for teaching new behaviors and so forth, or for manipulating consequences that we could put into a menu format even, for example, to pick the kinds of procedures that will eventually go into the behavior package. The package is going to have to make behaving the way we want someone to behave more reinforcing than behaving the way we don't want somebody to behave. Some things you need to learn about for all forms of differential reinforcement. The first one is, for any form in which we have an interest in using, what exactly is the behavior, the target behavior for reinforcement, and what's the criteria for providing reinforcers? So is there an interval involved? Whatever it may be. But we have targets for reinforcement that probably are going to be different than the actual target for change. That makes sense. We're not going to reinforce inappropriate behavior. We want to reinforce other behavior that's desirable. If there are intervals involved, exactly how long are they? What do they involve? How do we determine length of intervals? For example, for DRL or DRO, which do involve intervals, how do we decide where to start? Do we reset the intervals contingent on a misbehavior, for example, or do we not say anything at all, wait till the end of an interval, and then provide a reinforcer if the problem behavior hasn't occurred? That's an interval-based differential reinforcement of other behavior. What do we do if the undesired behavior occurs? Do we say something to the person? So what? There's got to be a decision made. Do we use verbal feedback or do we not use verbal feedback? Any differential reinforcement package, we have these things to consider, and your textbook talks about the possibilities. So if we're going to use differential reinforcement of whatever type, we're going to end up with a script that describes these things, and there are guidelines and rules for making initial decisions about them, many of which you're responsible for. It's important to consider motivating operations as part of planning differential reinforcement. And we have to realize that sometimes motivating operations make our reinforcers more or less effective. I should say here now also that assessing a reinforcement is critical for differential reinforcement. We have to make sure that the consequences we're using are actually reinforcers or highly desirable reinforcers, or they're not going to be effective, certainly not more effective than the reinforcement the child's already receiving for inappropriate behavior. So reinforcer assessment or preference assessment should be a part of any intervention planning. I'm just noting here that your textbook provides guidelines, procedural guidelines for making these procedures as effective as they can be. And I'm not going to specifically discuss all of these. I think the textbook's very clear about those, but your objectives specify which of these you should know, and you need to just learn them. Some kind of differential reinforcement, I'm saying, I think it's true, is part of almost every intervention package that you might use in an applied setting. First two types of differential reinforcement to reduce problem behavior would be DRI, differential reinforcement of incompatible, or DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. These can often be difficult to tell apart, and I am not too concerned about these differences. Both of these procedures make problem behavior inefficient. Consider the matching law. If I'm providing more powerful or more frequent reinforcers for some behavior, an alternative or incompatible behavior, and that's greater than the reinforcement that exists for the problem behavior, or at the same time I attempt to reduce the amount of reinforcement for the problem behavior, the problem behavior becomes not as efficient as some alternative because it doesn't get as much reinforcement, as frequent reinforcement, or whatever it is. So we certainly have to use, for these procedures, we have to use good reinforcers, and the purpose of DRA or DRI is to make problem behavior, again, inefficient. Just to also note that differential reinforcement of alternative behavior can involve negative reinforcement. So we have differential negative reinforcement of incompatible, or differential negative reinforcement of alternative. Functional communication training, I gave the example earlier, we might reinforce asking for a break. That's an alternative behavior. And that, of course, would be reinforced negatively by providing a break, an escape from some activity. So differential reinforcement doesn't just mean differential positive reinforcement. As in all interventions that we're likely to apply, they may not be sustainable in applied settings. So we always want to use the least amount of intervention necessary to produce desired effects, but sometimes the interventions are going to require some effort on the part of people in a problem setting. So any differential reinforcement plan needs to involve a plan for somehow moving back towards more natural kinds of reinforcement. One of these may involve thinning the schedule of reinforcement to a sustainable level, increasing the ratio of responses to reinforcement, raising criteria for reinforcement, delaying reinforcement. Could involve shifting control to the target person by using self-management, and so forth. But and your book talks about the idea of fading initial levels of reinforcement back towards something that's sustainable or natural. Otherwise, the people in charge of interventions may be unlikely to continue to implement them with some fidelity. Differential reinforcement of other behavior provides delivering a reinforcer if the problem behavior has not been occurring for a specific time or is not occurring at a specific time. So it's a reinforcement for not doing certain kinds of behaviors, for not responding in certain ways. With interval DRO, if problem behavior occurs, it contingently results in the delay of reinforcement. So technically that's punishment. In other words, let's say we have a 2-minute interval DRO. If the target person doesn't exhibit problem behaviors during that 2 minutes, she earns a reinforcer. If she does, we reset the interval and the reinforcer cannot be earned for another 2 minutes. This contingent is the idea of contingency here. The contingent delay is essentially punishment. For momentary DRO, at any, let's say, the interval momentary DRO of 5 minutes, every 5 minutes at the exact end of the 5-minute interval, if at that moment the problem behavior is not occurring, then we provide reinforcement. There's no contingent delay. So DRO especially in this case is like a form of punishment. So thinking about whether what it does, DRO interval especially makes problem behavior ineffective. If you exhibit a problem behavior, you're not going to get reinforcers. In fact, you're going to delay reinforcement. Or inefficient, the momentary DRO, by providing more reinforcers when you're not misbehaving than when you are. So still thinking about the idea of whether these make problem behavior ineffective, inefficient, or irrelevant. Momentary DRO certainly makes it inefficient. Interval DRO makes it ineffective because it contingently delays reinforcer delivery. Interval-based DRO involves an interval, and so does momentary DRO. With interval-based DRO, the child has to behave not inappropriately for some length. Initially, that should be set similar to the real interval between inappropriate responses. So the inter-response interval that sometimes needs to be assessed. And one of the problems with highly frequent inappropriate behavior is that these intervals can be very short and it can be difficult to manage in applied settings. We have to specify the particular contingent stimuli that's going to be earned, careful definitions, and whether or not we're going to reset a timer for interval DRO. If you have an interval in which if a child doesn't misbehave, he earns some positive consequence, then when he misbehaves, you have the option of either resetting the interval or not resetting the interval, and you have a choice of either telling a kid he misbehaved or not. These are decisions should be made clinically with consideration. For example, if I pay attention to the misbehavior, am I inadvertently providing contingent attention that could act as a reinforcer? With momentary DRO, you also have to set intervals, and your textbook clearly describes that these intervals can either be variable or fixed. Just to reiterate what I said, fixed interval DRO, varied interval DRO, and momentary DRO. So I can have a fixed interval momentary DRO, in which case if there's at the end of some interval with at that moment the child's not exhibiting the problem behavior, then reinforcement is provided. The interval is the child has to not exhibit an inappropriate behavior for some interval. So fixed or varied, momentary or interval. And you should understand how these things are arranged. Let me also note at this time that I did ask you to read some review articles about the use of differential reinforcement that provide some more specific information, and I really encourage you to do that. Interval DRO has been more widely used than momentary. There's clear evidence to me that it's more effective for initial suppressing of problem behavior. But momentary DRO may be very useful for maintaining reduced levels of problem behavior once they're down to a low level. So some people might want to start with an interval DRO, behavior is down to acceptable level, then shift to a momentary DRO. The momentary DROs are usually easier to manage, and it allows you to move and to fade out a type of differential reinforcement intervention. there are essentially three options for fading or extending DRO. You could increase the duration of time for the interval or for momentary. You could increase them proportionately by 10% or 15%. That's just a way of increasing duration. Or you could increase them based on the level of when behavior gets to a certain level. You could extend DRO to other settings or times of day, start at one place, extend it, and so forth, and can be combined with other procedures. But you're responsible for being able to articulate these ways to fade or extend differential reinforcement of other behavior. Differential reinforcement of low rates can occur in several ways. The first way is to reinforce inter-response times. So at the time between the first occurrence of a problem behavior and the second occurrence exceeds some criteria, then reinforcers are provided. If it occurs before the criteria is met, then no reinforcers are provided. For interval DRO, we divide a problem setting time into specific intervals, and if the problem behaviors during each interval are less than a certain criteria, reinforcers are provided. If they're greater than, then no reinforcers are provided. In full session DRL, the whole problem time, say it's a 1 hour reading period, for example, if problem behaviors are less than some set criteria, then reinforcers are provided. Interval DRL and full session DRL are designed to make problem behaviors or certain levels of problem behaviors ineffective. So problem behaviors can exist at some level, the criteria, but if they're beyond that, then reinforcers are not provided. So they're not effective. High rates of problem behaviors are not effective any longer at receiving reinforcers. Low rates, those we assume are tolerable, are still effective at producing reinforcers, but not the high rate. So these also can be effective. DRL and DRO are really about the same thing. A DRO is a DRL of 0, is one way to think about it. If anything beyond 0 is allowed, then it's a DRL paradigm. And finally, there are guidelines for fading, again, DRL. You can use baseline data to guide the selection of initial response limits or the inter-response time limits. And we want to set the first criteria at the baseline level so kids can earn, or people can earn reinforcers, or slightly lower. You can gradually thin the schedule by changing criteria for full session or decreasing the number of responses per interval in interval DRL, or you can adjust the inter-response time for space responding differential reinforcement. And finally, just to remind you, later in the quarter we're going to look at group contingencies. Group contingencies for reinforcement are essentially a group form of differential reinforcement. It can be group DRO, group DRL, group DRA, and we'll talk about those. And as I said, differential reinforcement can be self-managed by someone.